All right, Kingdom Plantae. Just one more unit before we get to the Kingdom Animalia, and I'm looking forward to that. But I don't want to downplay, even though I tend to, I don't want to downplay the plants too much because they are extremely important. I mean, for example, imagine this scene with no plants. What would there be? Nothing but dirt and rock, and that's it. And when I say dirt, I mean ground up rock. There is a difference between dirt and soil. Soil has organic material in it from once living organisms mixed in with the dirt. That's soil. So soil plus or dirt plus organic material is soil. But if we were looking at this and plants never existed, there would be just rock and dirt, and that's it. And we definitely would not even be here. So plants are an extremely important group. They're the producers, right? So we're talking about mosses and ferns and grasses, and I added herbs here. Herbs are just, they're flowering plants. They're non-woody flowering plants. And then the woody plants are shrubs and trees, right? So those are what we're talking about when we're talking about plants. And you don't want to confuse mosses with algae. Mosses are the most primitive plants, but they're not algae. So a lot of people kind of confuse the two. When they see algae growing on a rock, they'll call it a moss. Or if they'll see moss growing on a rock, they'll call it an algae. So try not to confuse the two. So as far as general characteristics, all plants are multicellular. There's no such thing as a unicellular plant. There are unicellular plant-like organisms. Those are the algae in the in the Kingdom Protista. But all plants, true plants, are multicellular. They're also eukaryotes, right? So the Kingdom Plantae, along with Kingdom Fungi, along with Kingdom Animalia, along with Kingdom Protista, are all in the domain eukarya because they're all eukaryotes. So plants are eukaryotes. They have cell walls, which is common. Just about every group that we've studied so far has cell walls. There are only some protists that we've studied that didn't have cell walls, but otherwise, all bacteria or prokaryotes have cell walls. Fungi have cell walls. Now, plants have cell walls. We're the weird ones, us animals, without cell walls. And the cell walls of all those different organisms that have cell walls are made of different things, right? So in plants, the cell walls are made of cellulose, which is a carbohydrate. And they build that cellulose from the glucose that they make through photosynthesis. Plants are known as embryophytes. And if there's one synapomorphy, if you'll recall that term, it refers to the shared derived characters that any clade will have. And plants, the Kingdom Plantae, is definitely a monophyletic clade. The synapomorphy, the thing that they all have in common, is that they are embryophytes, along with other things, but the primary one is that they are embryophytes, which means that they develop from multicellular embryos that are protected within the tissues of the plant, right? So this all goes together, protected within tissues. Embryos, multicellular embryos, protected within tissues. That's what makes them embryophytes, And of course, they perform photosynthesis, which makes them photoautotrophs. That's their mode of metabolism. And that also makes them producers, right? They're making food for the rest of us life on land and in the water. But as you'll learn, some plants don't photosynthesize anymore. They've evolved away from that. And there are plants that have evolved away from land to live in the water also. So plants have been around a long time and they've evolved to fill all kinds of different niches. But anyway, they photosynthesize the same way certain green algae photosynthesize using chlorophyll A and B. So if that sounds familiar, that's because we were talking about it back when we were looking at the green algae. Because green algae, the chlorophyte algae, phylum Chlorophyta, they also photosynthesize with chlorophylls A and B. So plants were first to appear, or what I should say is when plants appeared on Earth, it changed everything. It was like a game changer. Again, think of this without any plants. Made a huge difference to terrestrial habitats and terrestrial environments and terrestrial ecosystems, life on land. Just like we see in rock succession, they were involved in developing soil. So the very first plants started to develop some soil, and then larger plants could then evolve, and larger plants, because larger plants need deeper soil. So as plants evolved, soil evolved. And so that takes us back to that whole idea of succession, rock succession, primary succession from rocks, and the development of soil. And again, soil is a combination of dirt, which is just ground up rock or rock dust, and organic material. So we're going to come back to this image as we go through the different groups of plants, because we have representatives in this image of all of them. What's growing on this rock are mosses. And here we have ferns, and we have conifers, or gymnosperms as we call them. And there are also flowering plants here, growing, herbs growing down here. I don't see any, well, and back here some bushes and probably some broadleaf trees to differentiate them from the conifers here, the needle leaf trees. So that's basically all the different groups of plants that there are, or the major groups anyway. So as I mentioned, not all plants are photoautotrophs. Some of them are parasites, like this huge flower here is from a species that actually parasitizes the roots of other plants and sucks the nutrients out of the roots of other plants. It itself does not photosynthesize, and it produces this huge flower that stinks like rotting meat to attract carrion flies. So there's a carrion fly right there, and the fly kind of acts like, bees when they pick up pollen and carry it from flower to flower. So in this case, this is a foul-smelling flower that attracts flies, and the flies do the same thing that the bees do for other flowers. The flies land on the flower and pick up pollen and fly to another one of the same species and transfer that pollen to that other flower. So pollination by carrion fly. And then this is another one that is saprophytic, which is very similar to fungus. And it's able to do that because of its mycorrhizal relationship with fungus. So this is a saprophyte kind of because of the symbiotic partnership that it formed with fungus. So just the point here is that not all plants photosynthesize. Some of them have evolved away from photosynthesis. And you'll notice that neither one of these is green. And by the way, you can find these growing around here in Ohio. They call it ghost pipe, or at least that's one common name. Something else that plants inherited from green algae is their life cycle. Shows alternation of generations. Remember that? Alternation of generations. We were looking at the same thing back when we were studying green algae. And so what you want to remember, and hopefully what you do remember, is haploid gametophyte, diploid sporophyte, haploid gametophyte, diploid sporophyte, haploid gametophyte, diploid sporophyte. That's what's alternating here as we go through the plant life cycle. And in early plants, in other words, the first plants to evolve, just like algae, the gametophyte and the sporophyte are two separate, large, multicellular plants that you can actually distinguish and see with the naked eye. I'm pointing out that, with the naked eye, because as we go through evolution, we go from mosses to ferns to then cone-producing plants and flowering plants. By the time we get to cone-producing plants and flowering plants, the gametophyte has become greatly reduced to just a few cells within the sporophyte plant. So there's an evolutionary change here, switch from in mosses, the gametophyte is actually dominant, and the sporophyte is smaller and it doesn't photosynthesize, plays less of a role in the life cycle. But as we go through evolution, that switches, and the sporophyte becomes dominant, and the gametophyte becomes just a few cells within the tissues of the sporophyte. But as this works here, the gametophyte's called gametophyte because it produces gametes. So then the sperm will fertilize the eggs, and that will produce a zygote, of course, like always. And by the way, the gametes are produced by mitosis instead of meiosis, because in us, gametes are produced by meiosis because we are diploid, right? Well, the gametophyte is haploid. Remember, haploid, gametophyte, diploid, sporophyte. So if the gametophyte is haploid, since the cells already have half the number of chromosomes, they don't need to go through meiosis to produce sperm and egg that are also supposed to have to be haploid. They can just produce sperm and eggs or gametes through mitosis. So, we're going from haploid gametophyte to haploid sperm or haploid eggs. And by the way, there are either separate structures on the gametophyte that are going to produce the sperm or the eggs, or separate individuals, separate gametophytes that are going to produce the sperm or the eggs. But then, of course, the sperm fertilizes the eggs, and that produces a zygote. The zygote then, that is the sporophyte plant. That zygote is the sporophyte individual, and it's going to start to divide and give rise to the multicellular sporophyte. The sporophyte then is going to produce spores by meiosis. So we go back to haploid. That's when we go back to haploid. The sporophyte produces haploid spores by meiosis. Those spores then germinate and give rise to new gametophytes, and the whole thing starts over again. So alternation of generations. Same thing that was going on in green algae. So what do plants need? Well, you know what plants need. They need light to photosynthesize, and they capture that light energy with the pigment chlorophyll and other accessory pigments, if you'll recall. But that's why, leaves are like solar panels. They're broad and flat to capture the sun's energy. Not all leaves are broad and flat, like pine needles are not broad and flat, and we'll get to talking about why pine needles evolved when we get to the gymnosperms. But anyway, plants need light for photosynthesis. They need water for photosynthesis too. If you'll recall, at the very beginning of photosynthesis, water is split. Water is split to get the electrons. That's the primary reason, and that's where the oxygen that's given off by plants comes from. So water is necessary for photosynthesis. Water is also necessary, kind of like a blood, to transport things around inside the plant, especially up from the soil through the roots and up through the stems and into the leaves. Water is necessary for that movement, that transport of materials. Of course, plants need minerals, and they get those minerals from the soil. So soil is important for plants. The minerals in the soil is important for plants. The water in the soil is important for plants. And by the way, a lot of the evolutionary adaptations that plants made for life on land was to help them limit water loss. So, for example, there's a waxy cuticle that covers plants that kind of seals them off so they don't dry up. Another thing that plants need is oxygen. If you'll recall, just like us, they have mitochondria in their cells, and those mitochondria rely on oxygen for carrying out aerobic cellular respiration. Remember, that's what aerobic means, right? With oxygen. So they have to have oxygen, but they also have to have carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, because that's where the carbon comes from to make the glucose, to make the carbohydrate, to make the sugar, right? And remember, that's called carbon fixation. Taking carbon from carbon dioxide out of the air and incorporating it into organic compounds like glucose. So that means they have to exchange gases with the surrounding environment. And, that's what this figure is showing. So what we're looking at here is if you'll notice, a zoom in on the cells of a leaf. And there are these specialized structures on the surface, and especially the upper epithelium of the leaf, called stomata. Those are openings through which the plant exchanges gases. So it will take in carbon dioxide, it will release the oxygen that it produces by splitting water, and also water vapor. Water in the form of a gas, water vapor will escape through those stomata. So there's a lot of gas exchange going on between plants and the atmosphere. And remember, the loss of water from plants is known as transpiration, right? Special transport of water from the soil up through the roots, up through the stems, out into the leaves, and then escaping from the stomata in the leaves. That's the whole process of transpiration. And that process is especially going on in vascular plants. Not all plants have vascular tissue. The evolution of vascular tissue was a huge evolutionary step for plants because it allowed them to grow high off the ground. So when plants first evolved, like the mosses, they're very short. They're very low to the ground. But when plants evolved vascular tissue, they were able to grow high off the ground. And so there are basically two types of vascular tissue, and we'll be looking at this in more detail later. But there's tissue called xylem. that transports water and minerals up from the soil, up through the stems, up into the leaves. That's xylem, and it pretty much transports in one direction. It's transporting water, but dissolved in the water. It's an aqueous solution that includes minerals, nutrients from the soil. But then there's phloem, and phloem transports sugars that are made through the process of photosynthesis from the leaves down into the plant, or from the roots where it might be stored, where the sugars might be stored or the carbohydrates might be stored, back up into the leaves when necessary. So the food produced by the plant can be transported around inside the plant in any direction by the special vascular tissue known as phloem. So that's what plants require. And if they don't get any one of these things or aren't able to perform any one of these things, they don't survive. The overall point here being that life out of water is tough. Life on land is tough. To adapt to a terrestrial habitat was a difficult thing for plants to do. So plants have common ancestry with multicellular green algae. And if you'll recall, green algae are in the phylum Chlorophyta. And back when we were studying the multicellular phyla of algae in the Kingdom Protista, if you'll recall, we were looking at ulva. Ulva is an example of a multicellular chlorophyte algae, and so that's what this picture is showing, ulva being also known as sea lettuce. And here's another one that is a green, multicellular green algae called Nightella, and it is a Caraphesian algae, just like this one is. So these are all in the phylum Chlorophyta. This one's in a different class. But here we're looking at the class Caraphisia, and Caraphisia is the class that is thought to be most closely related to plants. So plants have common ancestry with Caraphesian multicellular green algae, of which there are about 4,000 species, a little over 4,000 species. And, there's a lot of evidence just looking at the morphology, the structure and function of Caraphesian algae and plants, but there's also DNA sequence analysis that has upheld this relationship. So we know that plants are closely related to Caraphesian algae. So when did plants evolve? Well, it looks like they evolved at least 450 million years ago. The oldest plant fossils that we've been able to find are these microfossils of plant spores and sporophyte tissue. Remember, diploid sporophyte, right? Haploid gametophyte, diploid sporophyte. So this would represent a piece of a sporophyte plant. And these are the spores that that sporophyte plant might have produced, because these were found together. So based on this, it's been speculated that the first plants looked very similar to this. And you got to remember or picture here that this is actually very small. This is maybe a centimeter tall. So it's very moss-like, and it's a non-vascular plant. And that's why mosses have to grow so small. It's because they don't have vascular tissue. They don't have that xylem or phloem to carry or transport water high off the ground into the plant. So the plant has to remain very short, and that's how mosses are today. So these early plants were just evolving the ability to live without water. So they were, and just like mosses today are still dependent on water for their reproduction, it's thought that these plants also, the earliest plants, were dependent on water for their reproduction, and that's primarily to allow the sperm to swim to the egg. Now, higher plants that have evolved since that time, or since mosses, have evolved ways of reproducing without water. And we'll get to that later. They also had to evolve a way to be resistant to the rays of the sun, and we're talking mainly UV radiation. Ultraviolet radiation is very damaging, and so plants making the evolutionary move out of water onto the land had to deal with more ultraviolet radiation. So they had to evolve ways of protecting themselves against that. And a lot of those accessory pigments are all about protecting them from ultraviolet radiation. They had to be capable of conserving water. And I mentioned the cuticle earlier, cuticle being a waxy covering over the plant. So covering stems or leaves, and this isn't showing any leaves, but there's a waxy covering over stems and leaves to keep the plant from drying out. Eventually, they had to be capable or evolve ways of reproducing without water, and that's what spores and pollen and seeds are all about. So eventually, these are spore-producing structures here. So sporangia that would produce spores. So, the very earliest plants reproduce with spores. Mosses today still reproduce with spores, but eventually pollen and seeds evolved in the higher plants. And so we now have 4 different major groups of plants, but they can be divided into 2 major groups, right? So one being non-vascular, and that would be mosses. Mosses and their relatives are the only ones that are non-vascular, and then all other plants, didn't mean to move that, all other plants are vascular, have vascular tissue, have that xylem and phloem that I was showing you on the previous slide. So we're talking about ferns and gymnosperms, which are cone-bearing plants like conifers, pine trees, and then we have flowering plants. Those are vascular plants. And I just want to remind you, and this goes back to the unit that we just covered previously, none of this could happen. Plants could not have made this evolutionary advancement, or it would have been much more difficult for plants to make this evolutionary move from water to land if it weren't for the partnership, the mutualistic symbiotic relationship they formed then, 450 million years or more ago, with fungi, mycorrhiza, to enable them to get the nutrients and the water they needed from very poor soils. At that time, soil was very poor, very nutrient poor. And so they needed this relationship with mycorrhiza to be able to make this move on into terrestrial habitats. So what now exists in the plant kingdom, Kingdom Plantae, on the planet, are 4 major groups of plants. And what we're looking at here is a phylogenetic tree showing their evolutionary relationships. So this is the order of evolution, from mosses to ferns to cone-bearing plants to flowering plants. So these are the 4 major groups that I was talking about. And these are the 4 evolutionary events that had to take place, or evolutionary adaptations that had to take place, that define each group. And they are defined. They're defined as clades. They are monophyletic groups, or clades, even though their classification isn't necessarily according to clade. And what I mean by that is there is no one name, one taxa that we use to refer to the mosses and their relatives. There are phyla of mosses and phyla of moss relatives, and we'll be looking at that. There are basically 3 phyla that are in this clade, and they are monophyletic. They all have common ancestry, with a common ancestor that is non-vascular, because these are all non-vascular, and they're the only group that are non-vascular. So basically, they are classified or identified by what they don't have, not necessarily what they do have, but what they don't have, which is vascular tissue. But let's start at the beginning and just work our way through here. So we've got the Caraphesian-like common ancestor here. So that's an algae. It's living in water. And then we see the adaptations that allowed plants to to move out of the water to adapt to terrestrial habitats. And that would include a waxy cuticle to keep from drying out, protected embryo, multicellular embryo. Remember, that's why we call plants embryophytes. And also spores to allow them to reproduce without water. Even though they still require the sperm to swim to the egg, they're able to disperse their spores on the wind in the atmosphere. So that's an adaptation for life on land. But so these are non-vascular spore-producing plants, the very first and earliest plants, and they still are represented by the mosses and their relatives today. And of course, we'll be looking at each of these groups, so you'll understand what I'm calling their allies here, their relatives. And then we have the adaptation of vascular tissue. And that was a huge adaptation because mosses are small, but ferns and their relatives, their allies, could grow to the size of trees. And if you think back to when we were studying the Earth and life through time and the geologic time scale, back in the Carboniferous period, the Earth was covered with forests, and those forests were primarily made up of trees that were ferns. Ferns the size of trees. Ferns and their relatives the size of trees. So that was the importance of vascular tissue. The evolution of vascular tissue allowed plants to grow much larger. But these are still reproducing with spores. So the next evolutionary advancement was the evolution of pollen and seeds. And the first to do that were the gymnosperms, the cone-bearing plants. So they produce their seeds in cones. So they are vascular seed-producing cone-bearing plants, right? And then we have the evolution of flowers. And flowering plants are very successful, the most successful group of plants today. They are the most diverse, many, many more species than all the other groups put together. So we're talking about vascular seed-producing flowering plants, and they are known as angiosperms. And by the way, gymnosperm and angiosperm are kind of just common names. But angiosperms are represented by only one phylum, and that's the phylum Anthophyta. There are a number of phyla in the gymnosperms. There are a number of phyla with ferns and their relatives, and a number of phyla of mosses and their relatives. But only one phylum. All the vast diversity of flowering plants are all classified into one phylum due to their one synapomorphy, their one shared derived character, and that would be flowers. So, of course, flowers are pretty, but they were a huge evolutionary advancement. And this sequence, evolutionary sequence, and the relationship between these different groups has been upheld, of course, by DNA sequence analysis. So this is how plants evolved.